The atmospheric recyclers of Titan Station hummed their eternal song of artificial life support, a mechanical lullaby that had become Jake Harrison's constant companion during 6 months of captivity. He'd learned to read the subtle variations in pitch that indicated maintenance schedules, shift changes, and most importantly, when the Centaurian guards would be distracted by their own bureaucratic routines. Today, however, the usual rhythm was disrupted by an undercurrent of excitement that rippled through both the alien overseers and human prisoners alike. Word had spread through the detention blocks with the efficiency of a well-oiled rumor mill. Queen Seraphina herself would be conducting a personal inspection of the facility. Jake pressed his face closer to the ventilation grate he'd been assigned to clean, listening to fragments of conversation from the corridor beyond. The Centaurian guards were nervous, their normally fluid movements sharp with anxiety as they prepared for royal scrutiny. "Never seen her leave the capital ship before," muttered Davies, the prisoner working beside him. 3 years of occupation, and suddenly the Ice Queen wants to tour the dungeons. Jake kept his expression neutral, though internally he felt the familiar knot of tension that came with dangerous possibilities. He'd spent considerable effort over the past months ensuring he looked nothing like the Earth Defense Force lieutenant who disappeared during the Battle of Proxima Station. Malnutrition had hollowed his cheeks, deliberate scars from accidents during work details had altered the shape of his face, and layers of grime had obscured his distinctive green eyes behind perpetual squinting. "Probably wants to see how efficiently we're being processed," Jake replied, his voice carrying the defeated tone he'd cultivated. "Make sure we're not having too much fun in paradise." The morning's work assignments were interrupted by the arrival of advanced security teams, Centaurian warriors whose elongated ears bore the neural interface crowns that marked them as elite units. Their movements possessed the lethal grace that had made them so devastatingly effective during the war, and Jake found himself automatically cataloging their weapons and positioning before catching himself. Such habits died hard, even after months of playing the broken prisoner. By midday, the entire facility had been transformed into a showcase of Centaurian efficiency. Prisoners were arranged in neat formations, workstations gleamed with uncharacteristic cleanliness, and guards stood at perfect attention along corridors that normally echoed with casual brutality. Then she arrived. Queen Seraphina moved through the facility like winter given form, her presence causing conversations to die and hardened criminals to suddenly find their boots fascinating. Jake had seen her image countless times on propaganda broadcasts, but witnessing her in person was an entirely different experience. She was tall even by Centaurian standards, her elongated ears adorned with the complex neural crowns that indicated not just royal blood but active connection to her species' collective consciousness. Her movements were precise, calculated, carrying the confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation she couldn't control. Jake kept his head down as the royal procession approached their work detail, focusing intently on the atmospheric filter he'd been pretending to maintain for the past 20 minutes. Around him, other prisoners straightened reflexively, the ingrained human response to authority asserting itself despite months of deliberate demoralization. "These units maintain life support efficiency at 94%, the facility commander was explaining, his tone carrying the nervous precision of someone addressing absolute power. "Well within acceptable parameters for long-term containment operations." "Containment," the Queen repeated, her voice carrying the musical undertones that made Centaurian speech sound like carefully orchestrated harmony. An interesting choice of terminology. Jake felt rather than saw her attention shift to the prisoners themselves. Her inspection had been clinical so far, focused on systems and statistics rather than the humans operating them. But something had changed in the atmosphere, a subtle shift that made his survival instincts scream warnings. "You," her voice cut through the mechanical humming like a blade. "Look up." The command wasn't directed at him, but at Patterson, a former merchant marine who'd been working on the adjacent filtration unit. Patterson's head snapped up with the reflexive obedience of someone who'd learned that defying direct orders resulted in consequences that made death look appealing. Queen Seraphina studied Patterson with the detached interest of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. Facial scarring consistent with atmospheric exposure. Muscle atrophy indicating 6 to 8 months of inadequate nutrition. Classic signs of psychological conditioning. She turned to her aide. "Note the efficiency of the processing protocols." Jake felt his jaw clench involuntarily at the casual dehumanization, then forced his expression back to neutral. Getting angry wouldn't help Patterson, and it definitely wouldn't help his own chances of remaining unnoticed. But the Queen's attention was moving methodically through their work detail, and Jake realized with growing dread that his turn was approaching. He bent lower over his work, hoping that body language signaling complete submission might earn him a pass, but the footsteps stopped directly in front of his position. "This one as well." The command hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Jake felt every eye in the corridor focused on him, felt the weight of a moment that would either preserve his carefully constructed anonymity or destroy everything he'd worked to build. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his head. Their eyes met across the space between captor and captive, and Jake watched as Queen Seraphina's expression shifted from clinical detachment to something that looked almost like shock. Her elegant features, so perfectly controlled moments before, flickered through a series of micro-expressions too quick for the casual observer to catch. But Jake wasn't a casual observer. He was a man who'd spent 18 months remembering every detail of a face he'd seen for perhaps 20 minutes in the bombed-out ruins of Proxima Station. Recognition was a two-way street. The Queen took an almost imperceptible step backward, her hand moving instinctively toward the ceremonial blade at her side before catching herself. Around them, the facility continued its normal operations, guards and prisoners alike oblivious to the silent drama unfolding in their midst. "Interesting," she said finally, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor that could have been attributed to anything. "Very interesting indeed." Jake forced himself to maintain the blank, defeated expression he'd perfected, even as his heart hammered against his ribs hard enough that he was certain she could hear it. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with implications that neither could acknowledge without destroying them both. Finally, mercifully, she turned away. "Continue with your work," she told the assembled prisoners, her commanding tone restored. "Efficiency must be maintained." As the royal procession moved on, Jake bent back over his atmospheric filter with hands that shook only slightly. Behind him, Davies let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thought she was going to have you executed right here," he whispered. "Never seen anyone stare down the Ice Queen like that." Jake managed a weak laugh that sounded appropriately terrified. Wasn't staring her down. Was just scared speechless. But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of alien eyes on his back, and he knew with absolute certainty that his carefully constructed anonymity had just evaporated like atmosphere through a hull breach. Queen Seraphina had recognized the human who'd saved her life during the war. The question now was what she intended to do about it. The transfer orders came during the night shift, delivered by a guard whose nervous energy suggested this wasn't routine prisoner redistribution. Jake found himself reassigned to Special Maintenance Detail Alpha, which sounded official enough to avoid suspicion but vague enough to cover almost any activity the administration deemed necessary. His new quarters were marginally better than the previous dormitory, a single cell in the isolation wing that provided privacy at the cost of human contact. The official explanation involved specialized technical skills and security protocols, but Jake knew better than to believe convenient lies when his life hung in the balance. The work assignments that followed were equally suspicious in their mundane efficiency. Atmospheric processor maintenance in sections that rarely saw foot traffic. Gravitational stabilizer calibration during off-peak hours. Environmental control system diagnostics in areas where guards were mysteriously absent for extended periods. It took 3 days before she appeared. Jake was elbow-deep in a quantum air scrubber, trying to realign the molecular filters without triggering a containment breach, when the corridor's lighting shifted to indicate an approaching security detail. He continued working, expecting the usual cursory inspection and movement orders, but the footsteps stopped directly outside his work area. "Dismiss the escort," Queen Seraphina's voice carried the absolute authority that made questioning her commands unthinkable. "I'll conduct this evaluation personally." Jake heard the guard's acknowledgments and retreating footsteps, but kept his focus on the delicate calibration work. The quantum scrubber required precise adjustments, and any distraction could result in atmospheric contamination that would kill everyone in this section. It was also an excellent excuse to avoid eye contact with someone whose recognition could mean his execution. Interesting technique, she said, moving closer to observe his work. Most maintenance personnel would have triggered a cascade failure by now. Most maintenance personnel didn't serve on exploration vessels that needed constant environmental repairs, Jake replied before he could stop himself. The admission hung in the air between them, too specific to be coincidental, too revealing to be retracted. Queen Seraphina was quiet for several heartbeats. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, less commanding and more genuinely curious. The quantum harmonics are remarkably stable. Your previous experience must have been comprehensive. Jake carefully engaged the scrubber's containment protocols before turning to face her. Without the ceremonial court regalia, she looked younger than her propaganda images suggested, though the elaborate neural crown still marked her unmistakably as royalty. More importantly, the scar along her left ear was clearly visible, a thin line of tissue that Jake remembered creating when he'd cut away the twisted metal that had been slowly killing her. I've always been good with systems that other people have given up on, he said carefully. Systems that appear damaged beyond repair. Sometimes the damage is just surface level. Sometimes what looks hopeless just needs someone willing to try a different approach. She tilted her head, studying him with the same intensity she'd shown during the inspection, but without the clinical detachment. And sometimes attempting to repair damaged systems is dangerous for the person making the attempt. Everything's dangerous these days, Your Majesty. The question is whether the risk is worth the potential outcome. The formal title seemed to surprise her, as if she'd temporarily forgotten the vast gulf between their official positions. Jake watched her expression shift, walls going back up as political reality reasserted itself. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. I go where I'm assigned. That's not what I meant. Jake met her gaze directly for the first time since the inspection. I know exactly what you meant. And you're right. But here we are anyway. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgement of shared history that neither could safely address. Queen Seraphina had been intelligence gathering when Jake found her in the wreckage of Proxima Station, her cover as a mid-level tactical officer so complete that even her own troops believed she'd been killed in the opening bombardment. Saving her life had cost Jake his mission, his unit, and ultimately his freedom, but looking at her now, he found he couldn't regret the choice. The atmospheric processors in Section Delta require recalibration, she said finally, her voice resuming its official tone. You'll be assigned there tomorrow. Will that section also require private evaluation? It will require whatever level of oversight I deem necessary. Jake nodded, understanding the subtext. Tomorrow there would be another conversation, another careful dance around truths that could destroy them both. I'll make sure the work meets your standards. See that it does. She paused at the corridor entrance, looking back with an expression that was almost vulnerable. The quantum scrubber calibration was adequate. Your technique shows promise. After she left, Jake stood alone in the humming mechanical space, surrounded by the complex machinery that kept thousands of humans alive in the hostile environment of space. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was maintaining the very systems that enabled his own captivity, keeping functional the infrastructure that allowed the Centaurian occupation to continue. But he was also, apparently, maintaining something else entirely. A connection that transcended the boundaries of species and conflict, built on a moment of compassion in the ruins of war. He'd saved an enemy officer's life without knowing her true identity, and now that enemy had become something he couldn't quite define. Queen Seraphina clearly remembered Proxima Station as clearly as he did. The question was whether that memory represented opportunity or simply a more elaborate form of doom. His comm unit chimed with new work assignments, confirming his reassignment to Section Delta. The atmospheric processors there were notoriously finicky, requiring constant adjustment and presenting numerous opportunities for private consultation with supervisory personnel. Jake found himself almost smiling as he packed his tools. Whatever game they were playing, at least it promised to be more interesting than standard prisoner maintenance duty. And if Queen Seraphina intended to kill him for knowing her secret, she was certainly taking the long way around it. The atmospheric recyclers continued their eternal song, but Jake thought he detected a subtle change in their rhythm, a harmonic variation that suggested new possibilities in the sterile predictability of captive life. He'd learned to read the station's mechanical moods over months of careful observation. What he was learning now was that even the most carefully controlled environments could develop unexpected variables. Variables that might, with proper calibration, lead to outcomes nobody could predict. The Section Delta atmospheric processors were, as advertised, temperamental pieces of engineering that seemed designed to fail at the most inconvenient moments. Jake had been working on the primary circulation unit for 2 hours when Queen Seraphina arrived, dismissing her guards with the now familiar excuse of conducting detailed technical assessments. "Problems?" she asked, observing his efforts to coax cooperation from a particularly stubborn filtration matrix. "This entire system is held together by good intentions and quantum tape," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "Half the components are operating beyond their recommended parameters, and the other half are probably held in place by prayer. Yet it continues to function. Barely. And not for much longer if someone doesn't authorize proper replacement parts." He paused, glancing at her meaningfully. "But I suppose resource allocation isn't a high priority for prisoner facilities." Queen Seraphina moved closer, ostensibly to examine his repair technique. "Resource allocation is complicated. There are many competing priorities in times of occupation." "I'm sure there are." Jake's tone remained neutral, but she caught the subtle edge that suggested he understood the broader implications. "Must be difficult, balancing efficiency against long-term sustainability. More difficult than you might imagine." She was quiet for a moment, watching him work. "Tell me, Lieutenant Harrison, what do you know about Centaurian political structure?" The use of his name and rank hit Jake like a physical blow, though he managed to keep his hands steady on the delicate calibration controls. "I know that asking such questions could be considered treasonous for a prisoner of war. Consider it a hypothetical discussion between a maintenance technician and a supervisor interested in cross-species engineering perspectives." Jake couldn't help but smile at the absurd diplomatic fiction. "Hypothetically, I know that Centaurian society values consensus and stability above individual authority. I know that your nobility operates more like a corporate board than a traditional monarchy, with power distributed among various house factions. And I know that prolonged military campaigns constrain that consensus, especially when victory doesn't bring the expected benefits." "Perceptive. What else?" "Hypothetically, I'd guess that there are factions within your government who believe the current occupation policies are too lenient. Who think that keeping millions of humans alive is a waste of resources that could be better allocated elsewhere." Queen Seraphina's expression darkened. "And what would you estimate the consequences might be if such factions gained sufficient influence?" Jake stopped working and looked directly at her. The conversation had moved far beyond hypothetical engineering discussions, and they both knew it. Complete extermination. Why keep feeding prisoners when you can simply eliminate the problem entirely? A bleak assessment. A realistic one. Jake resumed his work, but his movements were tenser now. The question is whether more moderate voices retain sufficient influence to prevent such final solutions. Moderate voices require justification for their positions. Evidence that current policies serve Centaurian interests better than alternatives. And what kind of evidence would be compelling? Queen Seraphina was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if he'd pushed the conversation too far. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing information that could endanger them both. 3 days ago, intercepted communications indicated a coordinated attempt to assassinate key moderate leaders during the anniversary celebration next week. The plan involves framing human insurgents for the attacks, providing justification for implementing permanent solutions to what they call the human problem. Jake felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. How coordinated. Comprehensive. Multiple targets, synchronized timing, evidence trails that will convince even skeptical House leaders that humans represent an unacceptable security risk. And the moderates can't prevent this? Not openly. Any attempt to expose the conspiracy would be seen as treasonous collaboration with human terrorists. She paused, studying his face. Unless, of course, the evidence came from a different source. A source whose loyalty to Centaurian interests couldn't be questioned. Jake understood immediately. You need someone with detailed knowledge of station security systems. Someone who could identify vulnerabilities that human insurgents might exploit, and more importantly, someone who could prevent such exploitation. I need someone whose technical expertise could protect Centaurian lives while simultaneously demonstrating human capacity for loyal service. And in exchange, the continued existence of your species, for starters. Jake laughed, though the sound carried no humor. No pressure there. I'm not asking you to betray your own people, Lieutenant. I'm asking you to save them by preventing a massacre that will justify their complete elimination. And if we succeed? If we prevent the assassinations and expose the conspiracy? Then moderate voices retain influence, and humanity earns a reprieve. Possibly even a path toward eventual autonomy, though that would take years to achieve. Jake finished the atmospheric processor calibration and sealed the access panel before responding. You're asking me to trust that saving your life will somehow save my entire species. I'm telling you that 18 months ago, when you chose to save an enemy officer instead of completing your mission, you prevented a Centaurian civil war that would have resulted in the immediate extermination of all human prisoners. Queen Seraphina's voice carried quiet intensity. The intelligence I gathered during that operation was crucial to maintaining unity among the House factions. Your act of mercy literally saved billions of lives, but you had no way of knowing it at the time. The revelation hit Jake with stunning force. His unit's mission at Proxima Station had been to eliminate high-value Centaurian targets, but finding the wounded officer had changed everything. He'd assumed his decision to save her instead of continuing the assault had been a catastrophic failure of duty. You're saying? I'm saying that your capacity for compassion toward enemies has already changed the course of history once. I'm asking you to do it again. Jake looked at her properly for the first time, seeing past the royal authority to the person beneath. What you're really asking is whether I trust you. Yes. And whether you trust me. I trusted you enough to come here alone, despite knowing that you possess information that could destroy me politically. Information that could also get me executed. Which is why we both have strong incentives to ensure this conversation remains private. Jake considered the impossible situation they'd created. A human prisoner and an alien queen, bound together by shared secrets and the growing realization that their fates were inextricably linked. All right, he said finally. Tell me about these security vulnerabilities. And Queen Seraphina? Yes. Next time you need to have a treasonous conversation, maybe choose a location that doesn't require me to fix atmospheric processors while contemplating interstellar politics. It's surprisingly difficult to concentrate on both simultaneously. Her laugh was genuine and unexpected, transforming her entire face. I'll make a note of that for future conspiracies, Lieutenant. Just Jake. If we're going to save two civilizations together, we might as well be on a first-name basis. In that case, just Seraphina. Though only when we're alone. Understood. Now, about those assassination plans. The anniversary celebration of Earth's surrender was a masterpiece of Centaurian propaganda, complete with ceremonial displays of captured human military equipment and speeches about the benefits of peaceful integration. Jake watched the preparations from his position maintaining the ceremony hall's environmental controls, acutely aware that somewhere in the elegant choreography of political theater, assassins were preparing to murder the only alien standing between humanity and extinction. Seraphina had provided him with detailed intelligence about the conspiracy, but translating that knowledge into actionable countermeasures required intimate familiarity with the station's systems, familiarity that Jake had spent months carefully acquiring. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: sabotage the hull's atmospheric controls during the ceremony, creating chaos that would mask the assassinations while providing evidence of human terrorist activity. Jake's counterplan was significantly more complex and depended entirely on his ability to appear completely innocent while simultaneously preventing multiple murders. Atmospheric readings nominal, he reported through his comm unit, his voice carrying the bored efficiency of someone conducting routine maintenance. What he didn't report was that he'd spent the past week installing additional monitoring systems that would allow him to track exactly which environmental controls were being accessed and when. The ceremony began with the usual pageantry: Centaurian nobles arranged in precise hierarchical formations while human prisoners provided labor services that demonstrated their peaceful integration into the new order. Jake split his attention between his monitoring displays and the elegant alien figures below, trying to identify potential threats among the sea of elongated ears and neural crowns. Queen Seraphina commanded the central position, her bearing regal but her eyes constantly scanning the assembly. Jake knew she was as nervous as he was, though her political training allowed her to project absolute confidence while simultaneously preparing for assassination attempts. The first sign of trouble came 40 minutes into the ceremony, when Jake's monitoring systems detected unauthorized access to the atmospheric control network. Someone was attempting to introduce contaminants into the air circulation system, not enough to kill immediately, but sufficient to create panic and confusion. Jake's fingers flew over his control interface, quietly rerouting the contaminated air through emergency filtration systems while maintaining normal atmospheric readings on the official monitors. To any observer, he appeared to be conducting standard environmental maintenance, but he was actually engaged in invisible warfare against saboteurs he couldn't see. The second attack vector activated during the ceremonial presentation of surrender documents, when power fluctuations indicated someone was attempting to overload the hull's lighting systems. Emergency lighting failures would create perfect cover for close-range assassinations, allowing the killers to strike and escape in the resulting darkness. Jake had anticipated this possibility and spent considerable effort preparing alternative power routing through secondary systems. As the saboteurs triggered their overload, backup generators seamlessly maintained illumination levels, making their carefully planned chaos look more like minor technical difficulties. But the third attack caught him completely off guard. Prisoner designation J-4479, report to security immediately, announced the hull's communication system, using Jake's official prison number. Around him, Centaurian guards began moving toward his position with the purposeful stride of law enforcement conducting an arrest. Jake realized with sick certainty that he'd been identified as the source of the countermeasures. Someone in the conspiracy had been monitoring the environmental systems and noticed that their sabotage efforts were being systematically neutralized. Rather than risk exposure, they decided to eliminate the problem directly by having him arrested as a human terrorist. Jake Harrison, announced the security chief as guards surrounded his position. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts against Centaurian leadership." The timing was perfect. With Jake in custody and unable to continue his protective countermeasures, the remaining assassination attempts could proceed as planned. Worse, his arrest would provide additional evidence of human terrorist activity, justifying whatever brutal retaliation the extremist factions had prepared. Jake raised his hands in surrender, his mind racing through impossible scenarios for salvaging the situation. Around him, the ceremony continued with barely a pause, most attendees unaware that they were witnessing the prelude to multiple murders. Then Queen Seraphina's voice cut through the hull's acoustics like a blade. "Release him." The guards hesitated, clearly uncertain about conflicting orders from the security chief and the Queen herself. In that moment of confusion, Seraphina made a choice that would either save them both or destroy her political career forever. "Prisoner J-4479 is operating under my direct authority as part of a security operation designed to protect this assembly from terrorist threats," she announced, her voice carrying across the entire hall. His technical expertise has been instrumental in neutralizing multiple sabotage attempts during this ceremony. The statement sent shockwaves through the assembled nobles, who had just learned that their queen was working directly with human prisoners on security matters. Jake watched expressions shift from confusion to suspicion to outright alarm as the political implications became clear. "Your Majesty," the security chief began, "this prisoner has been identified as the source of protective countermeasures that have prevented this assembly from being murdered," Serafina interrupted. "Countermeasures that he implemented at my request and under my supervision." She gestured toward Jake's monitoring displays, which showed clear evidence of the sabotage attempts and their systematic neutralization. "Thanks to his efforts and knowledge of this facility's systems, we have not only prevented multiple assassination attempts but gathered comprehensive evidence of the conspiracy behind them." The hall erupted in chaos as nobles began demanding explanations, guards struggled to determine which orders to follow, and the carefully orchestrated ceremony devolved into political pandemonium. But through it all, Jake noticed that the attempts at sabotage had stopped completely. The conspirators, faced with public exposure and their plans in ruins, had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of treason. "Serafina," Jake said quietly, using her name publicly for the first time, "you just ended your political career to save my life." "I ended my political career to save both our species," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Though I admit the timing could have been better." "What happens now?" Queen Serafina looked out over the assembly of her people, many of whom were already forming the factions that would challenge her authority in the coming days. "Now we discover whether mercy and cooperation can triumph over fear and hatred. And whether two former enemies can build something better than what existed before. And if they can't, then at least we tried." "And Jake?" "Yes. Thank you. For Proxima Station, for today, for showing me that kindness between enemies is possible." Jake looked at the alien queen who had risked everything to protect him, whose recognition of his worth had transformed them both from conqueror and captive into something approaching equals. "Thank you for seeing me as more than just prisoner J-4479. You were never just a prisoner. You were the human who taught an alien queen that mercy was stronger than conquest." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though your maintenance work could still use improvement." Jake laughed, the sound somehow carrying clearly through the political chaos surrounding them. "I'll work on that. Assuming I survive the next few days. We'll survive together. Both of us, both our species. Because that's what partners do." Looking out over Saturn's rings through the ceremony hall's massive windows, Jake saw Earth hanging in the star-filled darkness like a blue promise of hope. It would be a long road back to freedom, but for the first time in months, he believed that road actually existed. The former enemy queen had recognized him not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a partner in building peace. Sometimes, Jake reflected, recognition was indeed a two-way street that led to destinations nobody could have imagined. And sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with the simple recognition that former enemies could become the architects of a better future.